The sun was setting over the polished windows of the Blue Room, one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants, casting golden reflections across the pristine white tablecloths. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson adjusted her pearl necklace as she walked through the heavy glass doors, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble floor. The maitre d' immediately recognized her. After all, she'd been coming here every Thursday for the past decade. "Good evening, Mrs. Thompson. Your usual table." "Yes, James. Though I'm dining alone today," she said with a slight edge to her voice. Her son had canceled their weekly lunch again. Third time this month. He kept saying he was busy with work and other commitments, whatever that meant. At 32, she thought he should have his priorities straight. Family first, always. As she settled into her corner table with its perfect view of the Boston skyline, Eleanor pulled out her phone to check her messages. Nothing from her son, just updates about the upcoming charity gala she was organizing. She sighed, remembering how things used to be when he was younger, when he would share everything with her. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of expensive silverware. Eleanor observed the other diners, mostly regulars she recognized from her social circle. Mrs. Davis was having her usual affair with her tennis instructor 2 tables over, and the Andersons were celebrating something with their extended family near the window. A young woman approached her table. Eleanor looked up, surprised to see an unfamiliar face in this establishment where she knew every server by name. The waitress was black, dressed immaculately in the restaurant's standard uniform, with her hair pulled back neatly in a bun. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Michelle, and I'll be your server tonight." Her voice was warm and professional, with a kind of refined accent that suggested good education. "Would you like to start with our special wine selection for the evening? We have a lovely Chateau Margaux that pairs beautifully with today's specials." Eleanor's lips tightened slightly. "I know what I want," she said curtly, not bothering to look at the menu. "I've been coming here longer than you've probably been alive." She rattled off her usual order, the seared scallops to start, followed by the duck confit, cooked precisely the way she liked it. As Michelle professionally noted down the order, Eleanor's phone buzzed. A message from her son. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we have dinner next week? There's someone special I want you to meet." Someone special. Eleanor's stomach clenched. The last someone special had been that dreadful girl from his office who'd been more interested in the Thompson family fortune than in her son. She typed back a quick, "Fine, dear. Choose the place and time." Throughout the evening, Eleanor found fault with everything. The water wasn't refilled quickly enough. The bread wasn't warm enough. The scallops were slightly overcooked. They weren't. Michelle handled each complaint with grace and professionalism, her smile never wavering. When the check arrived, Eleanor examined it with exaggerated care. The service today was disappointing. She announced to no one in particular, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. She signed the receipt, deliberately leaving the tip line blank, something she'd never done before at the Blue Room. As she gathered her designer bag and stood to leave, she caught a glimpse of Michelle's face. Not angry or upset, just showed a quiet dignity that, for a fraction of a second, made Eleanor feel something she quickly pushed away. She walked out without another word, her heels still clicking against the floor, already thinking about what this someone special her son wanted to introduce might be like. Little did Eleanor Thompson know, her actions that evening would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the carefully constructed walls of her world to their very foundation. Michelle's feet were killing her as she moved between tables at the Blue Room. 6 hours into her shift, and she still had 2 more to go. But she couldn't complain. This job helped pay for her medical school textbooks, and the tips were usually good. Usually being the keyword. She watched as Mrs. Thompson walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a tip that was exactly $0 on a $245 bill. It wasn't the first time she dealt with customers like this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Kill them with kindness, baby. Their prejudice is their burden to carry, not yours. Don't let her get to you, James, the maitre d', whispered as he passed by. Mrs. Thompson's been extra moody since her son started pulling away from their weekly lunches. He paused, then added with a knowing smile, though between you and me, I hear he's finally found someone who makes him happy. Maybe that'll soften her up eventually. Michelle just nodded and continued working. She had bigger things to worry about, like her neurology exam next week and the special dinner coming up. After 6 months of dating Robert, she was finally going to meet his mother. He'd been hesitant about introducing them, saying something about his mom being old-fashioned. But Michelle had dealt with old-fashioned before. As she served her next table, a lovely elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about how she and Robert had met. She'd been studying at the hospital cafe during her break from rounds, medical books spread everywhere, when he literally tripped over her bag. He'd spilled his coffee all over her textbook, but insisted on replacing it and taking her to dinner to apologize. Michelle, table 12 needs their check, called out another server, snapping her back to reality. She quickly printed the bill and headed over. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of orders, plates, and forced smiles. Later that night, as she was changing out of her work uniform in the staff room, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Robert. Hey beautiful, everything's set for next week. Mom confirmed. Warning, she can be a bit intense. But she'll love you once she gets to know you like I do. Michelle smiled at her phone. She'd handled intense before. After all, she was on track to become one of the youngest neurosurgeons in her program while working part-time. She could handle one dinner with her boyfriend's mother. Her coworker Lisa poked her head into the locker room. Rough night with Mrs. Thompson, huh? I saw what happened. You handled it like a pro, though. Michelle shrugged as she pulled on her comfortable shoes. Some people are just set in their ways. Can't let it bother you. She gathered her things, ready to head home. Besides, I've got bigger things to focus on. Got a big dinner next week. Meeting the boyfriend's mom. Ooh, meeting the mother. That's serious, Lisa teased. What's she like? Don't know yet, Michelle replied, pulling on her coat. But Robert says she's traditional. You know how some of these wealthy Boston families can be. Well, if you handle her anything like you handled Mrs. Thompson tonight, you'll be fine, Lisa said, giving her friend a hug. Text me how it goes. As Michelle walked to her car in the restaurant's parking lot, she thought about Mrs. Thompson's cold stare and dismissive attitude. She'd encountered people like her before, people who took one look at her and made assumptions. But Michelle had learned long ago that the best response was to rise above it, to let her achievements and character speak for themselves. Little did she know that her worlds were about to collide in a way she never could have imagined, and that woman who had refused to tip her would soon play a much bigger role in her life than just being another difficult customer. Michelle's apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of her coffee maker and the rustle of pages as she flipped through her neurology textbook. The morning sun streamed through her small kitchen window, creating patterns on her study notes. She'd been up since 5 a.m., trying to cram in some studying before her big evening. Her phone lit up with a message from Robert. Can't wait for tonight. Don't be nervous. Just be your amazing self. She smiled, but her stomach did a little flip. Tonight was the night she'd meet his mother, and despite her usual confidence, she felt butterflies. A FaceTime call from her mom popped up on her screen. Baby girl, are you ready for the big dinner? Her mother's warm face filled the screen. Michelle could see the familiar yellow walls of her childhood kitchen behind her. Mom, I've handled difficult surgeries in the ER. I think I can handle dinner with Robert's mother, Michelle laughed, but her voice wavered slightly. Mum, her mother raised an eyebrow. That's why you called me at midnight to ask what you should wear? Speaking of which, did you decide? Michelle walked to her bedroom, phone in hand, and showed her mom the outfit laid out on her bed. A elegant navy blue dress, professional but stylish. Conservative enough for a first meeting, right? Perfect. Her mom nodded. Now remember what I always taught you. Be yourself, stay gracious, and don't let anyone make you feel less than what you are. Michelle finished the familiar saying. I know, Mom. I've got this. After hanging up, Michelle went through her day like any other. Morning rounds at the hospital, a quick lunch break spent reviewing patient charts, and an afternoon seminar on advanced surgical techniques. But her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. Robert had been vague about his mother, only saying she was particular about things. Michelle knew his family was wealthy, old Boston money, but he never acted like it mattered. That's what she loved about him. To him, she was just Michelle, the girl who made him laugh and could talk about neuroscience for hours. At 6 p.m., she rushed home to get ready. As she put the finishing touches on her makeup, her phone buzzed again. A message from Lisa. Good luck tonight. Remember, you dealt with Mrs. Thompson yesterday. After her, this should be a piece of cake. Michelle chuckled, thinking about the previous night's difficult customer. Thanks. At least I know Robert's mom can't be worse than her. She typed back, not knowing how wrong she was. She gave herself one final look in the mirror. The navy dress fit perfectly, her hair was neatly styled, and her grandmother's pearl earrings added just the right touch of elegance. Her phone pinged with Robert's message. I'm downstairs. As she walked to his car, she saw him leaning against it, looking handsome in a suit. His face lit up when he saw her. You look beautiful, he said, giving her a quick kiss. Your mom's already at the house? Michelle asked as they drove through Boston's expensive neighborhoods. Yeah, she's probably rearranging my furniture as we speak. Robert laughed. She likes everything just so. But don't worry, she's going to love you. How could she not? Michelle smiled, but her heart was racing. They pulled up to a beautiful brownstone, and Robert squeezed her hand. Ready? As I'll ever be, she replied, taking a deep breath. As they walked up the steps, Michelle felt oddly confident. After all, she'd handled all sorts of difficult situations before. She was about to become a neurosurgeon, for heaven's sake. How bad could one dinner be? The door opened, and Michelle's confidence vanished in an instant. Standing in the doorway, wearing an expensive silk blouse and a shocked expression, was Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had refused to tip her just the night before. The world seemed to stop for a moment as three people froze in place, each realizing that this evening was about to become far more complicated than any of them had imagined. Time seemed to stand still in that doorway. The color drained from Mrs. Thompson's face as she stared at Michelle, her perfectly manicured hand gripping the doorframe. Robert, completely unaware of the tension, smiled broadly. Mom, this is Michelle, the one I've been telling you about. He beamed proudly, his hand resting gently on Michelle's back. Michelle, this is my mother. Michelle summoned every ounce of professional composure she'd learned during her medical training. With a graceful smile, she extended her hand. It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Thompson. Officially, that is. Mrs. Thompson's hand trembled slightly as she took Michelle's, her ruby ring catching the light. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Yes, officially. Robert looked between them, catching the strange undercurrent. Wait, you two know each other. Your mother dined at the Blue Room last night, Michelle said calmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I was her server. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert's expression shifted from confusion to realization, then to concern. He knew his mother's reputation at restaurants, her particular ways, her expectations. Well, Mrs. Thompson finally managed, stepping back from the door. Do come in. Dinner's getting cold. Her usual commanding tone had a slight shake to it. The inside of the brownstone was exactly what Michelle had expected. elegant artwork, antique furniture, and family photos everywhere. She noticed a younger Robert grinning from various frames, many showing him with his mother at charity events and social gatherings. They moved to the dining room, where a beautiful table had been set with fine china and crystal glasses. The tension was thick enough to cut with one of the expensive silver knives laid out before them. "I made your favorite, darling," Mrs. Thompson said to Robert, desperately trying to maintain normalcy. "The cook prepared that duck confit you love so much." Michelle couldn't help but notice it was the same dish Mrs. Thompson had ordered the night before. The one she had claimed was completely undercooked despite being perfect. Robert pulled out chairs for both women, still looking confused by the obvious tension. "Mom, did something happen last night that I should know about?" Mrs. Thompson busied herself with her napkin, avoiding eye contact. I wasn't feeling quite myself yesterday." "That's one way to put it," Michelle said softly, but with clear intent. She hadn't planned on bringing up the previous night's incident, but sitting here, watching Mrs. Thompson squirm, she realized this was a moment for truth. "Robert," Michelle turned to him, her voice gentle but firm. "Your mother came to the restaurant where I work part-time to help pay for medical school. She was less than pleased with my service, though I assure you I was nothing but professional. She left no tip on a substantial bill and made several, let's say, uncomfortable comments." Robert's face fell as he looked at his mother. "Mom, is this true?" Mrs. Thompson's hands shook as she reached for her water glass. I didn't know she was your Michelle. You never mentioned she was." "Was what, Mom?" Robert's voice had an edge to it now. "A waitress? Black? What exactly didn't you know?" The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. Michelle watched as Mrs. Thompson struggled to find words, any words, to justify her behavior. "I think," Michelle said, breaking the tense silence, "we should all take a deep breath. What happened last night happened. What matters now is how we move forward from here." Robert reached under the table and squeezed her hand, grateful for her composure. His mother stared at her plate, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her expensive silverware. The cook chose that moment to enter with the first course, a soup that nobody really wanted anymore. As she served them, Michelle caught Mrs. Thompson stealing glances at her, seeing her, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time. This dinner was far from over, and all three of them knew that nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The soup bowls sat untouched, steam rising into the uncomfortable silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "Mom, I think you owe Michelle an apology," he said quietly but firmly, "and maybe an explanation." Mrs. Thompson dabbed at her lips with her napkin, though she hadn't taken a single bite. I suppose I do." She lifted her eyes to meet Michelle's. "I behaved poorly last night." "That's putting it mildly," Robert muttered under his breath. Michelle sat straight in her chair, her med school interview training kicking in. "Stay calm, stay professional." "Mrs. Thompson, I'd really like to understand. Was it something about my service specifically?" The older woman's hands twisted in her lap. "Your service was perfect, actually." She swallowed hard. I have certain expectations about who should be serving you." Michelle finished for her, her voice level but direct. Robert pushed his chair back slightly, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Mom, do you have any idea who Michelle is? What she's accomplished?" "Robert, please." Michelle touched his arm gently. "Let your mother speak." Mrs. Thompson looked between them, seeing their easy affection, their natural connection. She took a shaky breath. "Robert hasn't told me much, just that you were in medicine." "I'm in my final year of medical school," Michelle said. "Top of my class at Harvard Medical. I'm specializing in neurosurgery." I work at the restaurant to help with expenses because I believe in earning my way, even though I have a full scholarship. The cook appeared again, attempting to serve the main course, but Mrs. Thompson waved her away. Nobody was interested in duck confit anymore. Harvard Medical? Mrs. Thompson's voice was barely a whisper. But last night, you were working an honest job to support myself, Michelle finished. Just like your son does at his law firm, even though he doesn't need to with his trust fund. Robert smiled proudly. It's one of the things I love about her, Mom. Michelle could have taken the easy route, accepted help from her parents, but she chooses to work hard. She's the most dedicated person I know. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed. I didn't. I never thought. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Robert's voice rose slightly. You didn't think. You just judged, like you always do. Like you did with every girlfriend I've ever had. But this time, Mom, this time you've gone too far. Robert, Michelle squeezed his hand. Remember what we talked about? About giving people a chance to learn and grow. Mrs. Thompson looked up sharply at these words, surprise evident on her face. She'd expected anger, resentment, even confrontation. Instead, she was being offered understanding. I don't deserve such kindness, she said quietly. Everyone deserves a chance to do better, Michelle replied. In my work, I see people at their worst moments, but also at their moments of greatest change. It's never too late to learn. Robert watched this exchange with amazement. Here was Michelle, who had every right to be angry, showing his mother more grace than she deserved. Mrs. Thompson's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the tears forming in her eyes. I've been so foolish. All these years, all these rules about class and status, and she looked directly at Michelle. I am truly sorry. Not just for last night, but for everything my behavior represents. The clock continued to tick, marking this moment of truth. Michelle nodded slowly, accepting the apology but knowing actions would speak louder than words. Perhaps, Michelle suggested gently, we could start over. Not pretend last night didn't happen, but move forward from here. The tension in the room shifted slightly, like a break in storm clouds. Mrs. Thompson straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and did something she hadn't done in years. She admitted she was wrong. I would like that very much, she said. And I think we should all get some fresh soup. And while we eat, I'd love to hear about your work in neurosurgery. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you need. A chance to begin again. As the evening progressed, the fresh soup was served, and the atmosphere began to thaw slightly. Mrs. Thompson listened intently as Michelle described her latest research project on pediatric brain trauma. So you see, Michelle explained, her eyes lighting up with passion, if we can identify these markers early enough, we might be able to prevent long-term damage in children after accidents. That's remarkable, Mrs. Thompson said softly, seeing Michelle in a completely new light. Then her face clouded over as she remembered something. Last night, when you were explaining the wine pairing, I cut you off. I didn't even let you finish. Robert set down his spoon. Mom, what exactly happened last night? I want to know everything. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she recounted her behavior, the dismissive tone, the unfair complaints, the deliberate decision not to tip. With each admission, her voice grew smaller, the shame more evident. And you just left? Robert asked, his voice tight with disappointment. Without a tip, after she provided perfect service. Robert, Michelle interjected, your mother is trying to be honest now. That takes courage. But Robert wasn't finished. He stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. No, Michelle. This needs to be said. He turned to his mother. Do you know why I've been missing our Thursday lunches? Mrs. Thompson looked up, surprised by the sudden change in topic. Because every time we meet, You find some way to criticize everyone around us. The server's appearance, the hostess's accent, the couple at the next table. I couldn't take it anymore. His voice cracked slightly. I was afraid to introduce you to Michelle because I knew you might judge her unfairly. Mrs. Thompson finished, her voice barely a whisper. And I did exactly that. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different, heavy with understanding rather than tension. Michelle reached across the table and, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including herself, placed her hand over Mrs. Thompson's. You know what we say in medicine? The first step to healing is acknowledging there's a problem. Mrs. Thompson stared at their hands, her pale, aged one beneath Michelle's younger, darker one. I've lived in this bubble for so long, she said quietly. My friends, my social circle, we never questioned our attitudes. We passed judgments so easily. Robert sat back down, his anger softening as he watched his mother's defenses crumble. Yesterday, Mrs. Thompson continued, when you served me with such grace despite my horrible behavior, I felt something. A sense of shame I quickly pushed away. And now, knowing who you are, what you've accomplished, and most importantly, how much my son loves you, she took a shaky breath. I've been so wrong about so many things. Michelle squeezed her hand gently. We all have our journeys, Mrs. Thompson. What matters is recognizing when we need to change direction. Eleanor, Mrs. Thompson said suddenly, please call me Eleanor. She turned to Robert. Son, I understand now why you've been pulling away. I haven't been the mother you deserve. Robert's eyes softened. You can be, Mom. It's not too late. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. Michelle, would you be willing to start fresh? Perhaps we could have lunch someday. Just us. Before Michelle could answer, the cook appeared again, looking uncertain about whether to serve the main course that had been waiting. Yes, Michelle smiled. I'd like that. But first, why don't we try that duck confit? I hear it's actually quite excellent when you give it a chance. For the first time that evening, Eleanor Thompson laughed, a genuine, heartfelt sound that seemed to surprise even her. The ice had truly begun to break, and though there was still a long way to go, something new was beginning to grow in its place. As they finally started their meal properly, all three knew that this evening, difficult as it had been, was just the beginning of a much longer, more important journey together. The days following that eventful dinner were quiet ones for Eleanor Thompson. She'd canceled her usual social appointments, claiming a mild illness. In truth, she needed time alone with her thoughts. Sitting in her study, surrounded by family photos, she picked up a silver-framed picture of Robert as a child. His bright smile reminded her of how he'd looked at Michelle during dinner, pure love and admiration. She set the photo down and picked up her phone, scrolling through her contact list. Her thumb hovered over her best friend, Barbara's number. Usually, she would have called Barbara immediately after such an evening, but what would she say? Remember all those things we've said about those people over the years? We were wrong. She put the phone down, realizing for the first time how many of her friendships were built on shared prejudices. The doorbell rang, startling her. Through the security camera, she saw Lisa, her regular manicurist of 15 years, standing at the door. Eleanor had completely forgotten about her standing appointment. Mrs. Thompson. Lisa smiled as Eleanor opened the door. I was worried when you didn't answer my texts. Are you feeling okay? As Lisa set up her manicure station, Eleanor watched her work with new eyes. She'd spent countless hours with this woman, yet she realized she knew nothing about her life, her dreams, her struggles. Lisa, Eleanor said suddenly, do you have children? Lisa looked up, surprised by the personal question from her usually reserved client. Yes, two. My daughter's actually in college now, working on her business degree. That must make you very proud, Eleanor said softly, thinking of how she dismissed Michelle's accomplishments without a thought. It does. She works so hard. Has a part-time job, too. You know how expensive college is these days. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. How many times had she complained about service workers in front of Lisa? How many times had she dismissed people working their way through school? Lisa. Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. I owe you an apology. Mrs. Thompson. All these years, I've treated our appointments as if you were just here to serve me. I never asked about your life, your family. I've been a poor excuse for a human being. Lisa set down her tools, stunned by this unexpected conversation. Mrs. Thompson, are you sure you're feeling all right? Eleanor told her about the dinner, about Michelle, about her behavior at the restaurant. As she spoke, years of built-up walls began to crumble. I've lived in this bubble, Eleanor admitted, tears forming in her eyes. I've judged people without knowing their stories. I've probably hurt so many people without even realizing it. Lisa listened quietly, then said something that struck Eleanor's heart. It's never too late to change, Mrs. Thompson. The fact that you're even having these thoughts shows you're ready to grow. After Lisa left, Eleanor sat alone again, but this time with purpose. She opened her laptop and began to research. She read articles about unconscious bias, about systemic racism, about privilege. She found herself taking notes, highlighting passages, feeling like a student again. Her phone buzzed. A text from Robert, checking in. How are you doing? She typed back slowly. I'm learning. It's not easy, but I'm learning. Then she did something she'd been afraid to do. She opened her photos and found the picture Robert had sent of him and Michelle at her white coat ceremony. She made it her phone's background image. A small gesture, perhaps, but a reminder of the change she needed to make. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at her was the same, but something in the eyes was different. There was uncertainty there, yes, but also hope. She picked up her phone one last time and typed a message to Michelle. I know we agreed to lunch, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to meet for coffee first. There's a lot I need to learn, and I think you might be the best teacher I could ask for. The response came quickly. I'd like that. Tomorrow at 10. Eleanor smiled at her phone, feeling both nervous and relieved. Tomorrow would be the first day of her new journey, and for the first time in years, she was ready to listen and learn. The small coffee shop buzzed with morning activity as Eleanor arrived 10 minutes early, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap. This wasn't her usual type of place. No fine china or white tablecloths. But Michelle had suggested it, saying it was where she often studied during medical school. She spotted Michelle already seated by the window, medical textbook open beside her coffee cup. She looked different outside her waitress uniform, confident, professional, completely in her element. Eleanor took a deep breath and walked over. Good morning, Eleanor said softly. Thank you for meeting me. Michelle looked up with a warm smile. I ordered you a cappuccino. Robert mentioned it's your usual. The gesture touched Eleanor deeply. Here was the woman she treated so poorly, thinking of her preferences. She sat down, noticing the easy way other customers greeted Michelle, clearly a regular here. I went back to the blue room yesterday, Eleanor said suddenly. I spoke with the manager. I left a very generous tip for the other night, and I asked him to apologize to the staff for my behavior over the years. Michelle nodded appreciatively, but said nothing, waiting for Eleanor to continue. I've also been doing a lot of thinking. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly. About how I've lived my life, the judgments I've made, the people I've hurt. She paused, gathering courage. I'd like to tell you about something that happened 40 years ago. She took a sip of her cappuccino, then continued. When I was in college, my best friend was a girl named Grace. She was brilliant, kind, and she was black. My parents found out and Eleanor's eyes welled up. I chose their approval over her friendship. I've carried that shame for 40 years. Michelle reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand. Thank you for sharing that. I've spent decades building walls, joining the right clubs, saying the right things. Eleanor wiped her eyes carefully. But seeing you with Robert, seeing how happy he is, how accomplished you are, it made me realize what I've been missing all these years. A young doctor in scrubs stopped by their table. Dr. Michelle. I used that study technique you showed me. It worked perfectly for the boards. Michelle beamed at him. That's wonderful, David. Keep it up. Eleanor watched this interaction with growing admiration. You teach other doctors too. Just informal mentoring, Michelle smiled. We all need help sometimes. Eleanor thought about her own life, how she'd always seen helping others as beneath her status. Michelle, I want to do better. I want to be better. Not just for Robert, but for myself. I don't know where to start. Michelle closed her textbook. Well, there's a program at the hospital where volunteers read to children in the long-term care ward. Many of them don't have family nearby. You think I could do that? Eleanor asked uncertainly. I think those kids would love to hear stories from someone with your dramatic flair. Michelle smiled. And I volunteer there on Thursdays. Eleanor caught the significance. Thursdays, her old lunch day with Robert. A chance to create new traditions, better ones. I'd like that, Eleanor said, then laughed softly. Though I might need some advice on what to wear. I doubt channel suits are appropriate for reading to children. Actually, Michelle grinned, the kids might get a kick out of that. Especially if you do the voices. They both laughed, and for the first time, it felt natural, unforced. As they continued talking, Eleanor found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. Her fears, her regrets, her hopes for the future. As their coffee cups emptied, Michelle glanced at her watch. I have rounds soon, but same time next week. I'd love that, Eleanor said, then added hesitantly. And Michelle, thank you. Not just for giving me a chance, but for showing me how to give myself one too. As they stood to leave, Eleanor noticed her reflection in the coffee shop window. She looked different somehow, lighter, as if she'd set down a heavy burden she'd carried for far too long. She had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, she was walking in the right direction. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Boston Children's Hospital sparkled with celebration lights. The annual fundraising gala was in full swing, but this year was different. Instead of her usual table with her social circle, Eleanor Thompson stood proudly at the podium, adjusting the microphone. Good evening, everyone, she began, her voice clear and confident. For those who don't know me, I'm Eleanor Thompson, and I'm here tonight to announce something special. She scanned the crowd, spotting Robert and Michelle at their table. Michelle was radiant in her evening gown, her hand intertwined with Robert's. Next to them sat Lisa, her manicurist, whom Eleanor had personally invited, along with several hospital staff members who'd become friends over the past months. For 30 years, I've attended this gala, Eleanor continued. I've written checks, posed for photos, and thought that was enough. But 6 months ago, I learned what it truly means to make a difference, thanks to one remarkable woman. Her eyes met Michelle's across the room. Many of you know Dr. Michelle Carter as one of our most promising young neurosurgeons. But I know her as the woman who taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that it's never too late to open your heart and change. Eleanor pulled out a small card, though she knew the words by heart. Tonight, I'm proud to announce the establishment of the Carter Thompson Scholarship Fund. This endowment will provide full medical school scholarships to minority students who, like Dr. Carter, dream of serving others through medicine. The room burst into applause. Michelle's hands flew to her mouth in surprise, tears glistening in her eyes. Robert beamed with pride at both his mother and his now fiancée. He proposed just last week. But that's not all, Eleanor continued once the applause died down. Every Thursday for the past 6 months, I've had the privilege of reading to children in our long-term care ward. These brave young souls have taught me more about courage and joy than I learned in all my years in Boston's social circles. She gestured to a group of hospital staff members. Working alongside our dedicated healthcare workers, I've seen firsthand how much more we can do. So, I'm also announcing the creation of a new pediatric family support program, ensuring that every child in long-term care has access to educational and emotional support resources. More applause filled the room. In the back, Eleanor spotted some of her old social circle watching with mixed expressions. Barbara, her former closest friend, looked particularly uncomfortable. Eleanor had stopped attending their weekly bridge games months ago, tired of the gossip and judgment that used to feel so natural. Someone wise once told me that the first step to healing is acknowledging there's a problem. Eleanor's voice softened. My problem was living in a bubble of privilege and prejudice, thinking I knew better than everyone else. But life has a funny way of teaching us lessons, sometimes through the very people we once judged unfairly. She reached for a glass of water, her hand steady now where it once would have trembled. Tonight isn't about me or my journey. It's about creating opportunities for others to pursue their dreams, about supporting families during their darkest hours, and about building bridges where there once were walls. Eleanor looked directly at Michelle again. Dr. Carter will be heading the scholarship committee, ensuring that we select candidates who show not just academic excellence, but also the compassion and dedication she exemplifies every day. As she concluded her speech, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The woman who had once refused to tip a waitress because of her race was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that true wealth lay not in social status, but in the connections we make and the lives we touch. Later that evening, as Michelle hugged her with tears in her eyes, Eleanor whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me that night." Michelle pulled back, smiling. You know what they say in medicine. Sometimes the hardest cases turn out to be the most rewarding. They both laughed, and Eleanor looked around the room, at Robert beaming with pride, at the hospital staff she now called friends, at the future she never imagined possible 6 months ago. She realized that while she always thought of herself as Boston's elite, she'd never felt truly rich until now.